afternoon and welcome back. It's our season premiere of InFocus right here. I'm Melissa Ridge and we have missed you, and certainly lots has happened since we last saw you here in May. The summer kicked off with the confirmation of graves at several residential school sites. It was the first time that many Canadians had to come to grips with this truth, and the world watched our shame. Then the federal election was called, and for the first time ever, reconciliation was the #2 issue for many Canadian voters, behind climate crisis, but ahead of issues like post-pandemic economic recovery and affordability. And then this country stopped for its first ever Truth and Reconciliation Day. That's on September 30th, of course, just last week. So it's fitting that today we're putting reconciliation in focus. We have incredible guests to discuss what it means for Canada to be at this fork in the road. Journalist Betty-Ann Adam, Cowessess Chief Cadmus DeLorme, Winnipeg Aboriginal Council President Damon Johnson, and two incredible people who are helping organizations in their journeys to reconcile. They've got lots to say about people who want to be allies, including that it's the wrong foot to start off on. We're going to tell you why, and trust me, when they explain it, it will make perfect sense. Our phone lines are open. You can join the conversation. You can phone us toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Okay, so let's start with Murray Sinclair, former commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I had the opportunity to sit down with him for the first Truth and Reconciliation Day, and I asked how he hopes Indigenous and non-Indigenous people would mark that day.
There are many who believe that reconciliation is for non-Indigenous people to do, that they're the ones who have to change their ways. And in many ways, it's like the couple who are coming out of a violent marital relationship, that the one who perpetrated the violence is the one who really has to change his ways or her ways. But also, the victim of all of that violence also needs to take a look at what the impact of that violence has had upon their lives and their own sense of victimization and their sense of looking to the perpetrator to heal them or to help them get over it. We can't expect that a government which has come from this long history of oppression is going to be holding the answers for us. And the answers are going to have to come from our own culture, our own ways of doing things, our own belief systems, our own teachings. And so what I have said to Indigenous leaders since the TRC report was filed is that we have our own internal process of reconciliation to do, and that is we have to start teaching our children their culture. We have to start teaching our children their language. We have to start teaching our children that they are just as valid as the non-Indigenous kids out there, and that our ways of doing things will still work today. And it's up to us to figure out how to make that happen.
Joining us now is longtime journalist Betty-Ann Adam. She's a former reporter with the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix, currently with Eagle Feather News. She's also a 60s Scoop child, a filmmaker, and currently co-chair of the Indigenous Society of Saskatchewan, and she's joining us from Saskatoon. Betty-Ann, I'm so thankful that you could take time out of your afternoon to join us and talk about something that, we've been talking about for a long time as Indigenous people. Reconciliation needs to happen, but it's new that the rest of the country is really starting to talk about it too. So, you've been a journalist for 3 decades. I'm very curious, as you look back at the beginning of your career, news coverage of Indigenous issues back then versus where we're at in 2021, what sticks out for you?
Yeah, it's been a really an amazing progression, a slow evolution, and that it seems to be picking up. Back when I started with the Star-Phoenix in 1989, there were 2 kinds of news about Indigenous people. Number 1 news was courts, crime. Again and again and again. These were the stories that made the news. This was the impression that people had of Indigenous people. And when our people were victimized, they were referred to as prostitutes. They were referred to as, with these labels that were always derogatory.
High-risk lifestyles. Yeah.
Exactly.
All of the negatives.
And then there were various articles about things to do with Indigenous politicians, the FSIN here in Saskatchewan, for example, the Assembly of First Nations. But I think that most Canadians, or many Canadians, really didn't pay attention. I think they kind of tuned out to most Indigenous news, and we know that over many years, Indigenous people were studied, and those studies would make the news. And we think of the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and at that time it was an exhaustive study. There were so many people, Indigenous people, who contributed to that and tried to get their message across. And there were recommendations that came out of that. There were really important recommendations about recognition and respect and sharing and responsibility. And we heard references to the RCAP for quite a while. It would come up often in Indigenous stories. But once again, not all Canadians were paying attention to those stories. They weren't touching people at home where they lived. And the game changer was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the 6 years between 2009 and 2015. And then there were it was 6 years, 7 national events, numerous local events all over the country. News was coming out for 6 years. 6 years, news was coming out about children being taken from their parents at residential schools. And, there were a lot of Canadians who probably didn't want to hear about that. But 6 years of daily news about those children, people couldn't look away forever. Yeah. People were aware of it. And by the time the commission released their calls to action in December of 2015, people knew about it. And even then at that big national event, when the calls to action were released, Marie Wilson, one of the commissioners, told us specifically that the commission had found proof of 3,000 children who had died in the schools. So she said it then in 2015, she said it. And at that time she said that the commission believed there were at least another 3,000. And the commission had asked the government of Canada, they had petitioned them, asking them for money to have that investigated. And the government of Canada said no.
And then in 2021, we still have people who are confused or shocked when we say, here's graves found.
Exactly. Because, over those next, like when the calls to action were released, there was so much news there, for reporters. It was a heyday. It was like, there's so much news here. How do I focus on one story? Yeah. And so everybody went to the calls to action. That's where all the news attention was going, right? And so the calls to action became a big thing. And it really, and there was change that happened in Canada. We began to see an opening of minds and hearts. We saw Canadians who were, well, for instance, the Office of the Treaty Commissioner in Saskatchewan wrote curriculum for school materials, and it became mandatory in Saskatchewan that you had to learn about treaties in the classroom. And then the Office of the Treaty Commissioner hired a former diplomat, and he was from Saskatchewan. He was a Canadian diplomat, and they hired him to come and use his diplomacy skills to create a reconciliation movement in Saskatchewan. So all over Saskatchewan now, small towns and big cities have these committees of community leaders who really want to act toward reconciliation. So we saw those kinds of things happening. We saw the universities all come together and declare that they wanted to indigenize. And University of British Columbia, of course, created the Indian Residential School Center for Dialogue, History and Dialogue, with Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, no less, at the helm. I mean, big things were happening. We saw the TRC loosened something, and changes began to happen in Canada. And yet, creeping complacency, that's what I call it, creeping complacency. A lot of people, I think, start to get tired of it. They started to tune out again. Yeah. And then last year, December 2020, was the 5-year anniversary of the release of the calls to action. And some Canadians who were paying attention to the news that day noticed that the National Centre released a banner with 3,000 names of those children that Marie Wilson talked about 5 years ago. It came out. And there it was on the national news. I was listening that day. I saw it on APTN. I saw it on CBC. I listened to it on the radio. And yet, as you point out, 6 months later, Kamloops made the search, right? They noticed that news and they looked into it. Let's see what's here. And it was, you know, as Indigenous people, I think we were stunned at how stunned the rest of Canada was.
I would totally agree with that. That's what we were saying here at APTN, is like, the shock was how shocked we were, that people were shocked. We have to move on here quickly. We're going to be coming up to a break here, but I just wanted to ask you, tell us very quickly, you've got a new film coming out.
Yeah, the 60 Scoop Indigenous Society is looking at the overlap between the 60 Scoop and first the residential schools, which led to the 60 Scoop, which in many cases is implicated in MMIW. We know that this is the case. The National Inquiry said that the child welfare system was one of the paths to MMIW. So we produced a film. It's called Everything is Connected, and we'll be releasing it we'll be having our debut in Saskatoon in early November. We'll be releasing it in early November. It's called Everything is Connected. Yeah.
Are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Betty Ann, thank you. I knew that this would be a great idea to have you on to chat, because, you know, 30 years of watching what people consume and what they react to as a journalist. I knew you would have a thrilling perspective on this, and you did not disappoint. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us.
It was my pleasure.
So Cowessess was the third community in a few short weeks this summer to confirm unmarked graves at residential schools on their territory. At a press conference to announce the 751 graves, Chief Cadmus Delorme told national and international media this has got to be a turning point for Canada. I caught up with him earlier this week. Chief Delorme, we're so thankful that you could join us here. So you've had a lot on your plate this year, above and beyond the unmarked graves. Before that, you know, Cowessess was one of the first communities to take back jurisdiction for child welfare under C-92. Lots of emotion, lots of work that's been put in for you and your community. How did September 30th affect you personally?
It allowed me to understand a lot of the emotions, the stress. There's a reason why we do this. You know, our children dance powwow, where a school once stood, our Marivelle, where, you know, our grandparents weren't allowed to dance. So just to see the children dance our powwow ways, to sing our songs, it was uplifting, and it verified everything we're doing is we're healing one day at a time.
Yeah. You know, is this just going to be about wearing an orange shirt one day a year, or do you think that Canada and Canadians are ready for something more?
This country is at a moment in our history where everybody is starting to reset their compass. And what I mean by that is the unmarked grave story for Indigenous people, for survivors, I have found its validity, verifying that the pain, the hurt, the anger, the frustration, the tiredness is real. And this was verifying to non-Indigenous people, or people who are not associated with residential school survivors. The shield is down, admitting that they don't know much about the true history is there. And so, you know, for Cowessess, September 30th is every day of the year. We are reconciling, we are moving forward, but we're also addressing the truth. So, you know, one of the things I see Canada making sure we do is that you cannot move to reconciliation until we accept the truth. So I find the next year or two very uncomfortable, but we must all understand there's only one truth.
What would you like to see governments and corporations doing for their part in reconciliation? So beyond just individuals, what do you want, that bigger umbrella, those big meaty organizations, governments and whatnot, what should they be doing if you could give them any advice?
There are 94 calls to action. The authors of those 94 calls to action are the over 100,000 residential school survivors who told their story. I would like to see organizations, companies, governments give out their report card as to updates on what numbers they're implementing, what numbers affect them directly in their bylaws, to their governance, to their social clubs, to their individual staff lives.
Yeah.
What are they doing to empower the 94 calls to action? There's no legislation to enforce it, but the orange shirts was uplifting and amazing. But maybe we gotta start to see, and not request or not force, but just say, where's your report card and the progress you're making to the TRC?
I love that, and thank you for taking time to share your thoughts with us. We love our people out at Cowessess for sure.
Nebraska, thank you very much.
A report card is always a good idea to keep tabs on progress. I think we have a caller now. Russ, are you there?
I am, Melissa.
Hey, Russ.
I'm glad you're back.
Oh, we're glad to be back.
Very important. Your show's important to all people.
Oh, well, thanks for that. What did you want to add?
I grew up in Welland, Ontario, and I did not know any Indigenous people until I was a teenager. The only brown person I knew was a Yugoslavian immigrant. Now he's the chief of police of Niagara Falls, Ontario. But in Fort Erie, we have the Native Culture Center, and they're a big presence here. Mayor Wayne Redicop always gives tribute to the Haudenosaunee Nation. So I think your show should do a remote, come down to Fort Erie, and make your presence known. You've got to keep it coming. Don't even take a holiday.
Well, we'd love to take our show on the road. I would love that. COVID kind of put a damper in some of our plans to do some shows on other locations, but we take that, we're going to add that one to our list. Russ, thank you for calling in.
Keep it coming, Melissa.
Awesome. Thanks, Russ.
Be well.
So I want to share with you one of my favorite parts of the Truth and Reconciliation Day programming that we had here right on APTN. Future history host, artist, and ambassador Seraine Fox sat down with 5 youth from across Canada to discuss reconciliation. They talked about what they're learning today and how that's going to shape their world as they grow. Let's watch a clip from Reconciliation and Me, and then we're going to take a quick break and come back.
It's time to heal. It's time to listen. And it's way past time to have this conversation. If not now, when? If not us, who? This is one step. Reconciliation is me, we, and you.
What are some of the most important things you've learned about Indigenous people so far?
Even though they're the first peoples, we still treated them badly.
The settlers came and they kind of ruined the Indigenous people's lives.
Like the residential schools, there were lots of Indigenous people found dead in them.
It's hard to hear that, right? It's hard to know that, right? And I think that it's important for us to share our truth with one another because, look, when we know the truth, we have that reaction, we have that feeling of compassion, of humanity amongst one another, right?
Something really important that I've learned is how unfairly Indigenous people were treated and still are.
It was wrong that they forced to go into the schools because they were here first, and then it's sort of they got their home taken away from them, and they didn't deserve that.
For Indigenous people, so much of what we know and what we learned comes from our elders. And so one of the effects of residential school is that our elders didn't always pass on that knowledge. One of our prophecies, for me as an Anishinaabe person, I should say, is that we would know that the future was going to change when the young people started to teach their parents, their brothers and sisters, their elders. And so that there would be this transformation. And they're the ones standing up and saying, hey, we want to talk about this. We're not shy. We might be nervous to get started, but we want to change the world.
Join our conversation now. Call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Welcome back. Let's go to social media now with our social media editor, Jesse Andrishko, to hear what some of you are saying about allyship and reconciliation.
Thank you, Melissa. It's great to be back in the APTN headquarters. Last week, after the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we asked online, what does it mean to be a good ally after the orange shirts are put away? We got a lot of interesting comments. Let's take a look. On Facebook, Tanya said, the voice of an ally should help to amplify the voices of us natives, not speak over us and drown us out. Celeste commented, do your own research, educate yourself, then we can talk. A simple Google search will tell you everything you need to get started unless I offer. You are not entitled to my knowledge or experience, and if I do offer it, respect it. Jody shared some advice saying, don't use your allyship to further yourself or as justification to say or do things that negatively impact Indigenous peoples or communities. Amanda said, step out of your comfort zone and lead by example, creating positive impacts. Check privilege and intent, continue to learn, heal, and grow. Create space for Indigenous people to share more truth, continue to listen, to learn, creating space for more healing and growth for all people. On Twitter, Sarah said, keep promoting and celebrating Indigenous voices and ingenuity, pressing government to live up to treaty obligations. Janet commented, always speak gently and kindly to our street people. They are our most hurt and vulnerable. People often treat them like they are subhuman. Realize their place there is directly connected to colonialism. Laura said, continue to hound your MP and the Prime Minister to institute the Truth and Reconciliation recommendation. Educate yourself and develop a better understanding. Be supportive. From Jason, reconciliation must include land back and Indigenous sovereignty. Allies need to support the front lines like Wet'suwet'en and the Fairy Creek. Sandra commented, it means to not stand idly by if hate speech, racism, ignorance is happening in my presence. It means to listen when given the chance to learn more and to promote positivity towards the First People of Canada. I promise to do my best. Lastly, Roland shared a simple piece of advice, just listen. Thank you everyone that took the time to share their thoughts. If you'd like to add your opinion, here's how. Join our conversation now. Call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Great comments in there, and thank you, Jesse. Damon Johnson is a man of many hats here in Winnipeg, the city with Canada's largest urban Indigenous population. He's with Winnipeg Executive Council, president of the Aboriginal Council, and sits on countless grassroots boards, working closely with urban Indigenous First Nations, Inuit, and Metis. Well, he couldn't join us live today, but we did catch up with him for a chat about reconciliation yesterday. Here's some of that. The work that you've been doing, Winnipeg Aboriginal Council, but then just as a First Nations guy yourself, September 30th, what did that feel like?
Well, I was very pleased because I've been a political activist, Indigenous, all my life, and I don't look for miracles. I look for milestones, or I look for steps forward. Sometimes if they're only incremental, that tells me, yes, we are trying to get better. You know what I mean? That's what's important.
Did you feel like that was a milestone?
Absolutely, absolutely. Even though the Prime Minister appeared to let us down, or did let us down, he's one person still. Yes, he's the Prime Minister, and he's supposed to be an example and a good example to all of us, but he's only human too. Sometimes our expectations are unrealistic. You know what I mean? So when I look at the Prime Minister, I look at him not just as the Prime Minister, as Justin Trudeau, and who is he, and where has he come from, and what does he represent? You know what I mean? Yeah. And you got to be fair and reasonable about that. So sometimes our expectations of anyone are not reasonable.
What do you feel like? I mean, I certainly felt that Canada finally took a moment to listen to some of the things, pay attention to some of the things that we've been talking about, certainly, myself as a journalist, an AT person, as a First Nations person, things that we always knew to be true, and working towards improving things. And it kind of felt like on September 30th that there was a whole bunch of other people who stopped to really take notice, too. It was a strange feeling.
Well, I like an analogy, And so, to me, building relationships is like building a house. if the foundation is faulty, house is going to fall down, right? And so what is the foundation of Indigenous relationship with other Canadas, with Canada, with other Canadians? You know what I mean? And it's flawed. It's hugely flawed. Like the Indian Act made us, did not recognize us as human beings. We were similar to women. We didn't get the right to vote until the 60s, you know what I mean? So this is the realities, and you have to go through those realities, and you have to address those realities in building a new relationship. And you have to build that consensus on, what is the truth? And the truth will be painful. And some Canadians will, well, we know Canadians are a mix too. And so you've got people on the far right who just hate others because they look different, you know what I mean? Don't consider us human beings still, you know what I mean? So that's that whole panorama of humanity in Canada. And so as leaders, and I'm only one leader, I can only speak for myself and the council, but I say we have to go to the fundamentals of what the relationship has been. We have to admit where the flaws are. We have to have some agreement on that. And then we have to make a commitment to change those things. And so, the Indian Act is still there.
I know.
1876, the current version. Before that, you had an act for the gradual civilization of India. You know what I mean? So that's all our history. And Canadians, many of them are far too ignorant of the truth of that. You see what I mean? They will look at us and say, why don't you just pull your socks up and change your life for the better? Well, it ain't that simple. And put yourself in that treatment, in that place, what would you be like? Totally. I don't think you'd be much different than us. And I don't say for a minute that we're any better than anybody else, but we're certainly just as good as, and we can be better, just like anybody else. And that comes down to the individual and the group level, right?
Well, yeah, and it's the relationship building and the fixing some of the damage that was caused. Do you ever get people say, what do I do? They would look up to you when you're everywhere.
Yeah.
You're Damon Johnson, you're everywhere. You've been around the block, and people know you. Do you get non-Indigenous people say to you, like, Damon, what do I do to reconcile? What am I supposed to be doing? Do you get people asking that?
Well, again, that's a tough thing to answer. So there's things that you can do as an individual. So you could ask yourself the question, what is do I have any Indigenous friends in my life? Have I ever had an Indigenous friend or family in my house for supper? Do I have an Indigenous neighbor? Did I ever talk to him or her? You know what I mean? These are basic fundamental actions that an individual can answer these questions and then say, well, I don't think that's good. I'm going to act to change it. You know what I mean? And we've seen that. There's an organization called Circles for Reconciliation. And one of their first steps was to host talks on reconciliation in individuals' backyards. That's as basic as it gets. You know what I mean? And maybe that's the building block.
I mean, and anybody could do that. Anybody in your neighborhood could do that.
And many are doing it.
Many are doing it. Let's have a circle for reconciliation and involve.
Yeah. Like I have many people in my life who I work with, but very few have ever been to their home. Right?
Yeah.
And very few could I say truly that they're a friend in the real sense of that word. Because for me, a friend is a very special person.
Yeah.
I don't call many people my friend. And these are people that I know would be there with me no matter what I was facing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. What do you see this country being in, 10, 20, 50 years?
I truly believe it will be in a better place for all of us in terms of truth and reconciliation, because I'm seeing signals, not just in you and me, but in many others, that they're wanting to go there, that they have the patience to hear us out, which is really critical, you know what I mean? And like I say, build that understanding of the truth and then say, we got to change this together. And again, Indigenous persons are only 5% of the Canadian population.
Yeah.
So there's everybody else, right? And we can't do this by ourselves, okay? So we've got to, you're looking at, this is not an overnight change. You're looking at, as you said, 10, 15, maybe 20 years before you see measurable difference.
I want to go back to that chat that we had with Murray Sinclair on September 30th. I asked him that day, what does justice and accountability look like for residential school survivors and for those children who didn't make it home? Here's what he had to say.
Well, first of all, I think it's awareness and acceptance on the part of the Canadian people that this, in fact, happened is part of that process. There are many who say that we'll never have justice until those who perpetrated the acts are brought to justice, or prosecuted and imprisoned, or something is done to them.
Do you think that will happen?
Well, the problem we have with that is that most of the people who committed these acts of misdeed are passed on. Yeah. And many of them will probably be in their 80s and 90s. And while we can lock somebody up in their 80s and 90s, what impact is that really going to have upon their lives? They will die in public institutions. But I think more importantly, the real question is, are we really going to feel a sense of justice if we work hard to perpetrate some form of violence against the perpetrators, when we now have an opportunity to come to terms with establishing a relationship of peaceful coexistence? If we can do that, then I think we should really focus our minds on doing that.
So back in June, an Environics poll found non-Indigenous Canadians had become more supportive of Indigenous rights and more concerned at the slow pace of progress that was being made towards reconciliation. Well, a growing proportion also recognized that they as individuals have a role to play in efforts to reconcile. So with that, I took to the streets of Winnipeg this summer to ask what people think.
I think there's people bringing more awareness, especially with social media. Yeah. It's a lot easier to see and listen to Indigenous voices, and I think a lot of people are becoming more educated, and of course there's always going to be people who are dumb and aren't really listening, but I think for the most part the majority of people, at least more than our parents' generation, are going to be listening and speaking up.
Seeing how many kids were found, and not only just in all of the kids, how many they found was just a lot, and they probably realized that they should be doing something, because stuff like that's still going on.
Yeah. I think the government could be doing more, but I think they're starting to but in my opinion, I feel like they're only really starting to recognize it because people are demanding that they do. I don't think they actually, a lot of them actually care that much, if I'm being honest.
Well, it's time for us to take another break, but before we do, I want to tell you a little something about when we were doing those streeters. I had asked a man if he had something that he would like to add to this conversation, and he said, I have nothing nice to say about Aboriginal people, so I have nothing to say to APTN. Have a great day. So it wasn't all nice girls like that who have smart things to say. We ran into our share of not nice people as well. When we come back, we're going to switch gears a little bit to talk about allyship. So from the other side of things, how is wanting to be an ally? It's the wrong way to approach the situation. There's an interesting discussion around that. First, let's take a look at another highlight from Reconciliation and Me.
So there's a lot I'm hearing from all of you. I'm hearing about changing the future, making the future brighter, action. I'm sure when you're learning about residential school and the history of Indigenous people, you must hear this word, reconciliation. And perhaps you've even now heard about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the 94 calls to action. But what is reconciliation? What does that word mean to you?
To me, it means fixing the mistakes we made in the past so that we can live peacefully.
Instead of dismissing the pain that the Indigenous people went through, it's probably better to listen to the stories and learn more.
Learning about what happened in history and trying to forge a better future and just acknowledge the problems that have been caused and just work together.
Yeah. And is it different? Is reconciliation different for you as young people than it is for your parents?
I think yes, because for our parents, I think reconciliation is like about learning the things they didn't have the opportunity to learn when they were in school and like using that information to make a difference. But for us, we're already like a step ahead almost because we have had the opportunity to learn about this as like young children.
Relearning, for some of your parents, it's like relearning. Like, what is reconciliation in action? How do you recommend people get started, even young people?
Yeah, I think they should speak up for what they believe in, because what you say, it's probably going to touch someone's heart and they might start doing something about it.
Welcome back. I had the chance to ask Murray Sinclair what he makes of Canadians' new desire to reconcile for this country's actions. Here's what he had to say.
Well, I think there is a growing body of reasonable people out there who are trying to figure out what to do and what they can do to contribute to the process of reconciliation. But the difficulty that they face is the difficulty that Canada faces generally, and that is there is a very vocal and influential group of people in Canada who hold significant positions of power, who are working hard against reconciliation. The people who are holding positions of privilege and who are benefiting from the riches of this country that have been taken away from Indigenous people, the people who have been taught to believe that they are superior to Indigenous people and don't want to think that they are not. So I said at the end of the TRC report, getting to the truth was hard, but getting to reconciliation will be harder, because I knew that there would be people working very hard, very forcefully, and even violently against reconciliation. And so one of the things that I make sure that non-Indigenous people understand is that we don't need you to help heal us. We need you to fix yourselves. We need you to get those people out there who are perpetrating this process of working against reconciliation under control. We need you to straighten yourselves out. We don't need you just to step forward and say, well, here's what we can do for you. Because my question always is, what are you doing for yourself? What are you doing to get rid of that violent vocal force that is out there that's holding us all back, holding this country back? Because that's what's going to stop reconciliation.
That man has so much great stuff to say. I hope lots of people were able to tune into that entire episode on September 30th, and it does live on YouTube under APTN Sunrise Ceremony if you wanted to watch that whole interview. Well, we've talked about truth and reconciliation from our perspective. Now let's talk about how reconciliation from the other side could work, and allyship. Joining us now is Lelaine Shaw from the Montreal Indigenous Community Workshop and Tim Fox of Indigenous Relations and Equity Strategy with the Calgary Foundation. I am so thankful that you guys could join us. This is, while a lot of people are talking about this now and a lot of people have been thinking about it for a little while now, you guys have been down this road for many, many years. Before we get into where we're at now, I want to go back to 2008. The apology in the House of Commons that set the stage for this Truth and Reconciliation Commission's work. Tim, you had said that that apology was damaging, and I found that fascinating, if you could explain.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that it's as damaging as it was missing a step. So I know as Indigenous nations, we were waiting in anticipation for that apology. We knew the significance of what it meant. But to me, I found on a broader level, Canadians in general, once the apology was delivered, it sort of amplified levels of confusion. Canadians really didn't have an idea of why the leader of our country was apologizing to a group of people. So there was a huge significant step that was missed that, to me, I feel like we have this responsibility to really embrace this truth-telling movement. I feel like there are significant changes that are needed to all systems. Gone are the days when we should expect Indigenous people to assimilate or to adapt into society and mainstream structures. It's now time for systems to change, and that requires a deep level of sense-making behind how historical context really shapes the infrastructure, the attitudes, the beliefs that exist in society and within our system. So the apology, was profound. It was significant. It moved me, being a child of residential school survivors, but there was definitely a significant step that was missed.
Yeah.
And something that we're sort of trying to amplify, I think, in these contemporary times.
It certainly lacked context for a lot of Canadians, for sure. And I think it did kind of fan the flames of, well, why do we have to apologize for you people? And that should have been, exactly as you said, that groundwork should have been laid before that apology. So the apology wasn't necessarily the problem. It's just that the steps were missed before that. Lelani, years ago, Montreal Indigenous Community Network, long before everybody started talking about reconciliation, you guys were planting the seedlings for reconciliation to happen. Tell us a little bit about the work that you guys have been doing for years now.
Yeah, absolutely. So my organization is heavily involved with the urban Indigenous population here in Montreal, which is a little bit different than kind of what we're seeing. More so, we hear a lot about the work being done in communities, in Indigenous communities. So we're really focused on coordinating and supporting the urban Indigenous community here in Montreal. So that's a little bit about what we do.
Mm-hmm. And tell us about this toolkit, this reconciliation toolkit.
Yeah, so one of the projects that we worked on was our Indigenous Ally Toolkit. So it's very much so a living document. So we're trying to always update it and get feedback from Indigenous people to make sure that the information is always relevant and it really reflects their realities and that they feel they can be represented by. And it was a really long process between a couple of between my team and some of our partners to make sure that allyship was really spelled out in a really easy toolkit that could be presented to anyone, whatever level of knowledge of Indigenous people that they have, to make sure that we can kind of ease the burden that's placed on Indigenous people to constantly teach non-Indigenous people that we are here and we are thriving.
I think, Tim, you called that, it's extractive reconciliation.
Yeah, I mean, to me, well, first of all, just a lot of gratitude to Leilani and her team for the creation of that original toolkit, that they were so gracious to work with us to adapt it to Treaty 7 territory. And I think what's really important about what her team did was they worked with the Indigenous community in the appropriate ways, in the ways that all people should be sort of working with First Nations communities. To me, there's this notion of knowledge extraction versus knowledge mobilization. And the way I sort of explain that is, for years, Indigenous communities have always been extracted from. We've been extracted from in land and resources. In children, we continue to be extracted from in children. And in this day and age, to me, it has the potential to show up as knowledge extraction. So it's just take. I feel like I'm more interested in trying to encourage those who have an interest in standing alongside us in this work to really mobilize the knowledge. So it's not enough to read an Indigenous Ally Toolkit or attend a workshop or to increase your level of understanding merely with that motivation. If you are doing that just to increase your level of understanding, to me, you're being no less extractive than settler ancestors before you. It's what you're going to do with this information that really makes the difference. So how are you mobilizing it within your own spheres of influence, related to your families, related to the community groups that you're a part of, and then ultimately to your workplaces? Because, like I said, the time has come for these systems to figure out ways to shift, to change, to adapt, to unpack and reconcile their organizational script, their narrative. There's a big portion of that story that has been missing, and now it's sort of, we're literally surfacing it through the discovery of all these children's remains. And we can no longer turn a blind eye to the work that really has to be done, but that requires systems to change.
Absolutely, and people to self-direct and educate themselves too. We have another caller. Terry is on the line right now. Terry, are you there?
Good afternoon. How are you?
Hey, I'm good, Terry. How are you doing?
I'm great.
You had a question, comment?
I do have a bit of a question and a comment. So as a white male, I understand that I have privilege, but as a member of the 2S LGBTQ community, I see the importance of allyship. As an ally to the Indigenous community, I've dedicated time to educating myself. I've taken the Indigenous Studies course. I've read the calls to actions, and I continue to listen to Indigenous voices. But my question is what more can I do?
There, I'll leave that to Tim and to Lelani.
Yeah, I think I have some thoughts. So I think taking those steps to increase your knowledge capacity is a really good first crucial step. Now I think you have to sort of find the ways to mobilize that. So how are you taking what you're learning and implementing it within the spaces that you're a part of? Like I said, related to your family. If you attend these online courses and you're sitting there saying, all right, I have this increased level of understanding, I'm motivated to help work for change and to shift for the progress of Indigenous people, you have to ask yourself, can you say that every person within your sphere of influence related to your family, your workplace, has that same level of understanding? And if the answer is no, then that's what's next. I feel like Murray Sinclair says this a lot, that the responsibility of reconciliation is going to be left up to future generations. And generationally, if we do this work right and in the right ways, by mobilizing this truth, making some sense of historical context, that will only be setting up the work of reconciliation for future generations a lot more seamlessly than how we're grappling with them today. But ultimately, we have a lot of work to do to embed this knowledge within the fabric of all of our institutions, of all, within society in general.
Yeah, Lelani, I'd like to know your thoughts on that too. What do you say to people who say, I want to be an ally? Where do I begin? Obviously, you would hope that they've begun by educating themselves. They're educated, they know the truth, but then the next step, what's your recommendations?
Yeah, so I think the point of good allyship is to be someone who doesn't place that burden on Indigenous people, and who really utilize their privilege in ways that are helpful to push all the narrative of that Indigenous people are laying out, whether that's in the Truth and Reconciliation report that came out or other reports from Indigenous communities. I know the caller mentioned that he was part of the LGBTQ community. Things that you can do is, like, in those spaces, I'm not sure if you're part of those spaces, but spaces, you could be asking, where are the Two-Spirit people in this space? How can we bring them in here, etc. So it's all about just making room for Indigenous people and not always speaking for them, but being very strategic of when you're bringing people in and not placing that burden on them.
And then, sorry, Melissa, can I add one more thought?
Yeah,
that
of course.
I think you should be critical of your motivations as well. So I don't think it's enough for people to strive to become an ally. That's not the point of it. I feel like you should realize the injustices that are being faced by the Indigenous community and that have been faced historically. You should realize that there is this epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that's happening, and people from, the Two-Spirited community, the queer, the trans community that are losing their lives. You should realize that there is no basic access to human rights for Indigenous people. That should be your motivation. You should recognize all of these social injustices that exist for Indigenous people and stand beside us to work towards change and to work towards the reparation of who we are, to dignify us, who we are as people, and to recognize that our lives are being lost to these systems who just do not do this kind of stuff. So less about being motivated to become an ally, more about being motivated to work towards social injustice.
Perfect. Well, we got to cut it off there. We are out of time. Time flies here on InFocus. I forgot how fast it flies. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Lelani. Thank you to all of our guests who joined us. That's a wrap on our inaugural InFocus for the season, putting truth and reconciliation in focus. Thank you all for joining us. This episode will be available for as download as a podcast on our website, aptnnews.ca/podcast. All of our past episodes are there too. Next week, we're going to delve into the colonial playbook. What's that, you ask? Well, you're going to have to tune in into APTN Investigates this Friday, and then we'll unpack more of that right here on InFocus next week. I leave you now with some closing remarks from that Reconciliation and Me and Serene Fox.
My mom used to tell me when I was young that you were given 2 ears and 2 eyes, but only 1 mouth. So listen and watch twice as much as you speak. My hope is that what you've heard and seen will help nourish the words you'll speak in conversations you'll have with those around you about truth and reconciliation. Speaking openly and honestly about our past, present, and future as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is a key part of the journey towards the bright future our young people are envisioning for us. Use the talents gifted to you by the Creator to make things better. Take care of yourself and others. Ask questions and be kind. Most importantly, be kind. This was one step. Let's keep this conversation going. Let's keep this conversation moving forward without forgetting the past. This is our mission, our responsibility, our destiny. Let's face it, with guts and grace, we can do this together. We can do this together, hey, Mama Matheson?